Since its inception, Rogue Trader established itself as one of the best ways to experience the wider Warhammer 40,000 universe. While most 40k games focus on a single battlefield or through the lens of an individual, Rogue Trader enables you to command an entire dynasty, make real choices with consequence which shape the world around you, and dig into the dark corners of the setting that rarely get attention elsewhere. It's an extremely immersive, all-consuming experience, and since launch, Owlcat have continued expanding and refining that experience with major updates, new content, quality of life improvements, and substantial DLC. Now, a new DLC arrives, which I'm very excited about, because this one introduces Trazyn the Infinite himself into the Koronus Expanse. And as we will discuss today, Trazyn is one of the oldest, strangest, and most unpredictable characters, and now will arrive directly into your Rogue Trader story. If you've yet to experience the quite simply enormous RPG world of Rogue Trader, I highly recommend, because with the arrival of Trazyn, the game offers one of the richest ways to experience the Warhammer 40,000 verse, and I should lastly mention their next title, Dark Heresy, is also on the horizon, so please click the link below to wishlist, and please check out my link for the Trazyn DLC below, which is out now. So join me as we explore the master of the prismatic galleries, Trazyn the Infinite. Trazyn, master of the Solemnace galleries, preserver of histories, and he who is called Infinite, is a legendary character because he exists as this perfect consolidation of all that is Warhammer 40,000. He is mysterious, enigmatic, comical, but deeply serious. He's ruthless and unrelenting, but also deeply apathetic to the majority of life forms in the galaxy. I've always imagined Trazyn to exist at the centre of this 40k Venn diagram, with the deeper, more serious narrative designated on one side, standing opposite the absolute memery of Gretchen being teleported inside Guardsmen or literally every Primarch, and so on. Now, I will readily admit that for the longest time, I'd always considered the Necron somewhat janky and almost akin to how I feel toward the Tau in their silliness. Now, I attribute this primarily to the fact that in my defense their early design really was bonkers. Spooky, ragey, scary space skeletons. These were the Necron released back in the days of 2nd, 3rd, 4th editions, and it wasn't really doing it for me at that time. Their lore was always intriguing, but it wasn't until the advent of a full Necron range refresh during the closing out of 8th edition and the start of 9th, so around 2020, this was when we saw the emergence of the stunning Illuminor Xeras miniature, but also just the darker, more cleanly executed look for the Necrons, which only continued to be stunning as well with the return of the Silent King, the new Catan, and recently the Nightbringer refresh that pulled me in more to starting a Necron collection, to where I now proudly have about 6,000 points painted in my Necron army, and that dynasty is still expanding its power for this next edition, and I do have my own headcanon lore for them, so probably need to do a video about that as well. I know many of you have also asked about my Knights continuing on as well. But it wasn't just about the aesthetics for me. The Necron had long been narratively neglected, typically for Xenos in 40k, and so at that same time they would be bolstered by what would become the opening of the Necron novel Floodgates. The release of the Infinite and the Divine was so successful that we were later blessed with the likes of Twice Dead King, Ruin, and more recently Tomb World, all of which I have only heard others speak well of, and I highly recommend all of these. It's certainly a refreshing change if you're heavily into things like Heresy, Space Marines, or Space Marines. Trazyn, of course, isn't an isolated figure though within the novels. He's had significant involvement with the evolving contemporary lore, most notably his interactions with Belisarius Cawl during the fall of Cadia, and for as much as Trazyn despises and considers lower forms to be beneath the majesty of the Necron dynasties, he also holds a strange curiosity, a strange closeness for humankind, something that other Necrons see as entirely contemptuous. Trazyn was the perfect non-Imperial figure to explore next in this 40k Legends series, which I admit I myself have neglected somewhat. And so I hope with a return to form you enjoy this, and if you're not already, please consider subscribing, dropping a like for this video, because we are, after all, chasing down that massive milestone subscriber goal this year. But anyway, let's now explore why it is that Trazyn, also known as the Infinite, has become such a figure of strange infamy and duality in the galaxy of Warhammer 40,000. Both a deeply intriguing figure with the immersive side of the lore things that I enjoy, but also somehow a total meme king for many others. But let me say it first though, two things can be true at the same time. Try to keep that in mind as we explore the figure, Trazyn the Infinite. Most of the great figures in the 40k galaxy are defined by their individual underlying ambitions, plus whatever greater agenda they may seek to enact. Most often, this is practically very simple, as most seek raw power, be that militarily, or in the case of rulers of worlds and systems, sometimes some other means of systemic control. Some seek more pure goals, such as just survival, and then there are those who are more dialed in, seeking to pursue individual quests of revenge, pilgrimages of faith, exploratory missions seeking conquest, knowledge, or just the eradication of their enemies. So it's not at all uncommon to see the hopes of entire factions rise and fall, chasing goals that could reshape the galaxy itself. This is the nature of Warhammer 40,000. But all the while, those of the Necron Empire have remained largely inert. They exist as a singular constant within the galaxy, having existed for over 60 million years, and only recently, from a human perspective, having begun their great reawakening. Their goals are endurance and to reclaim the galaxy they see as belonging to their great dynasties. In their slow emergence, they have come to discover that much has changed, and now there are many squatters having appeared on their tomb worlds claimed by their race before humanity even existed. And while the majority of the Necron remain in this state of deep hibernation, there are those who have begun to emerge, allowing only the few others required to serve them to awaken alongside. And this becomes a complex political issue among the Necron, for initially those who awoke early saw an opportunity to eliminate their rivals or even erase other dynasties whilst they were inactive and unable to defend themselves, sometimes even infecting their slumbering dynasties with viruses. Others sought to recover artefacts or scour territory of whatever aliens now occupied it. Others, like Trazyn, have agendas that are altogether different, which has led by comparison to the establishment of Trazyn the Infinite as something of an unusual or odd character, even absurd. Because Trazyn is this Necron overlord who, even before they became immortals of living metal, he was an academic. He wasn't a warrior or commander of armies, despite how he may appear now. He's certainly not an expert in close combat. He was one who spent much of his existence collecting artifacts, cataloguing events, and seeking to understand more than destroy. Since his awakening, Trazyn began once more collecting artifacts for his now great collection on Solemnace. In fact, so long and so vast was his gallery that it has become a maze to himself as much to anyone else. In some respects, he is just a collector with no boundaries or restrictions. He collects anything and all that is of interest to him, and he does so in this deeply addicted manner. His overall goal, though, does have some grounded base in sense, for while the majority of his race remains in a state of unconsciousness, he hopes to create this vast great work of all Necron culture, and indeed that of the entire galaxy since they entered their tomb complexes. He aims for this to be ready and complete for guests, as well as a catalogue of information to deliver to all the Necron dynasties once they're fully restored and reawakened, which is an ambitious goal. And Trazyn's gallery is something of legend in itself, his museum. It contains artefacts from the ancient Necron tier civilization before their ignominious fall into becoming dull metal beings. It charts the war in heaven, the Eldari, the rise and fall of humanity, the heresy, and so on. Moreover, Trazyn often seeks culture, not just specimens of interest. The reason for this is largely because the Necron are now essentially bereft of the ability to create their own art and culture, and so Trazyn has sought to capture the best of this from other civilizations, no matter that they often present poorer comparisons to the greatest works of the Necron tier. In his great quest, Trazyn can feel very unlike so many other notable figures throughout the galaxy. In many ways, I think he is more comparable to someone like Belisarius Cawl than anybody else, because he represents the setting better than so many others who command vast armies or sit at the centre of galaxy-shaping conflicts. Because like Cawl, Trazyn is this altogether more rounded, pleasing, comical personality. His goals go beyond war and extermination, and in that there's a humour and eccentricity within this figure whose motivations touch upon some of the oldest themes in the galaxy, like cultural memory, loss, preservation. For Trazyn, his great struggle is not just against the alien horrors, the dark gods of the warp. He battles against entropy, time itself, which is this underlying theme for the Necrons in general. But more specifically for Trazyn, he also seeks preservation where so many seek destruction, and the loss of even a single ceramic work of art, a teacup, for Trazyn is as crushing as the loss of an entire world to the Imperium, which again adds to his comedy. But I do need to say from the outset that for me, Trazyn is a deeply interesting, complex figure even. And this is why it can be frustrating for those of us on the more serious lore side of things tonally to see somebody like Trazyn be reduced, be so significantly diminished to basically lol Necron with Pokeballs. It's like, we get it, but no. To understand why Trazyn matters, it's helpful also to have anything beyond a superficial understanding of the lore and the 40k galaxy, because, as always, you need to step back and consider the nature of history itself in the galaxy of the 41st millennium, and of course, as always for me, the context. The Imperium, for example, comically claimed to seek the preservation of knowledge through the Mechanicus, determined to see once again their elevation and the glory of humanity once more. It routinely does the complete polar opposite of this. They destroy anything which might be problematic to a single individual's agenda or even the wider Imperium. At any given time, records disappear beneath crushing layers of bureaucratic stratification. Literal mountains of administrative paperwork may burn. Let us not forget, it's also not unknown for entire worlds to be just lost in the Imperium through simple administrative errors. Ancient human technology is treated at best as being a sacred relic rather than machines to be understood. So despite themselves being presented as these guardians of knowledge, in truth, the Imperium is a crushing history of technological suffocation that's buried under 10,000 years of myth, propaganda, censorship, and just a slow march into a near irreversible state of decay. Even their greatest heroes become distorted over time. Things from their heresy bear no resemblance to their accounting in M41. Deeds are rewritten for political agendas. They're exaggerated, they may be simplified or just rewritten entirely to suit whatever narrative is required for the bureaucratic or the ecclesiarchy, to whatever they deem it to be most useful at a given time. True human history survives only in these fragments, scattered across a million worlds, lost within archival labyrinths which have no centralized means to search their material or communicate beyond even a local level. And so you might then imagine that those such as the Eldari, for example, would be far superior in terms of their cultural history. But in so many respects they fare little better. It's obviously very different, but the Eldar had their time to rule the galaxy. Now, much of that empire vanished forever during the fall. Entire worlds were consumed, and the vast quantities of their knowledge with that. They had survived for millions of years, but they disappeared in this single catastrophic moment. So now what remains of the Eldari is preserved through scattered craft worlds, fading tradition, mythology, and mainly the artistry of the likes of the Harlequins and the slow fading memories of basically a species in a terminal decline. By contrast, just to mention it, the Orcs barely care about history at all. They're creatures whose entire culture is driven and repeated in the present. You've got the horrors such as the Tyranids, more hard to quantify, but I think we can basically speculate that the Tyranids have obviously no literal sort of documented culture. They have something more like a genetic memory, and that's not to diminish this. I think in some respects for the Tyranids, it's as important as any cultural chronology, and I think perhaps you could argue in some ways maybe their history is the purest version of that. For Chaos, they are, of course, a bizarre oddity. For starters, what do you mean by chaos? Are we talking about demons, cult worlds, space marines? What are we talking about? Then you have the issue that their history is twisted with lies and truth and time until reality itself becomes just unrecognizable. History mainly has value for cultures to look back and reference and build upon. For chaos beings, demons and the warp monstrosities, they have no need for this, and they exist effectively also outside of time, so it becomes almost impossible to make any real comparisons to mortal factions, not to mention the fact that they care not for artistry and collective worth, beyond obviously the perverse distortions of such concepts that are seen among the followers of Nurgle and Slaanesh. But really across every major faction, the past is either forgotten, corrupted, destroyed, eventually rendered inaccessible. But why? Really it's simple. It's just because the scale of time becomes this existential barrier for so many others, even those of Chaos in some respects. And if you've never read it, this is something that is heavily illustrated in The Infinite and the Divine, because it shows us the likes of Trazyn and Orokin existing over many thousands of years and how they interact with each other and events over that timescale. It feels as if it's just a matter of weeks or months from how they seem to perceive things, but for humans, it's on this scale of observing entire civilizations rise and fall. And that is really the key, I think, to understanding the Necron, but specifically Trazyn, because they exist on this entirely separate observance of time to mortal races. Trazyn's entire existence is built around preserving what others allow to vanish, and while many will see him as stealing from others, within his own perspective, that doesn't make any sense, because he's just securing those moments or masterful creations for all of time. I think there's many references that you could make to how Trazyn is like other collectors or archivists, but one which came to mind for me was Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End. Now, I will say spoilers briefly, but it deals with the end of human civilization, but through the arrival of an alien race who initially appear benevolent, and in some respects they are, but ultimately due to humanity's annihilation, they preserve what they can, removing cultural relics, preserving life forms from the planet to take back to their own world out of some sense of cataloguing and appreciation for other life that has existed in the galaxy. Trazyn is comparable here. He doesn't particularly care or seek to prevent or create the destruction of other civilizations. He exists as this observer. He's disconnected, removed. He's this archivist, a historian. And I think of him really as the last historian, not perhaps now, but one day at the end of all things, when the galaxy reaches its entropic endpoint. Trazyn will still be there and remember all that came before. Is Trazyn noble? Altruistic even? I don't think so, because despite his somewhat constructive perspective about things, it is still the case that Trazyn steals constantly, and often by any means necessary, for whatever he seeks often becomes more important than concerns about those in their immediate surroundings. If they have to be destroyed in the process, so be it. Should a planet need to be assaulted by an entire army so he can secure a singular artifact, so be it. He interferes in events that do not concern him as well. He removes these artifacts, individuals, sometimes entire groups from their rightful owners, and his activities bring him into conflict with other Necron as well, not to mention that the inhabitants of his galleries would strongly object to being preserved if they were given the opportunity to do so, and indeed sometimes they do. It's not an unknown eventuality for some to break out of their pocket dimensions and run amok in his labyrinthine gallery due to the sheer scale and the maintenance required to keep all things running securely. Essentially, his labyrinth on Solemnace is so vast that it's almost impossible to keep everything functioning perfectly at all times. But the difference with Trazyn is that unlike, say, a perversely greedy planetary governor, a rogue trader, or the like, he's not driven primarily by wealth or some sort of sense of prestige. He's pursuing something far greater, in many ways more pure. And I think there's even a moral argument to be made for his activities, but there's definitely one to be made against it as well. But in the full sense of his project, Trazyn is attempting to save history itself from extinction. And this is why I say I personally dislike this memification of Trazyn. I get it, it's funny, ha ha ha, but Trazyn is one of the truly interesting characters of Warhammer 40,000. He doesn't exist to just wage war and slaughter all before him in the name of something as pointless as factional supremacy. This speaks to something we will talk about a little more later on, that the Necrons are this civilization who did not just ascend and move beyond their mortal past. They remain still haunted by that memory. For when, in the vast depths of time, the Necron existed as the Necrontyr, they fought their wars beneath these hostile stars. They were people who suffered greatly, death defined their entire culture, and despite that their civilization still achieved incredible heights, but only to destroy itself through the desperation to live without this fear of death and the horrifying consequences of their physical ailments. Their solution to these problems was infamously to trade their mortality for bodies of cold living metal, in the process of biotransference. But at that time, the Necrontyr were unaware that they stood to lose almost everything that made them who they were. It was something which could not be undone, and has haunted them ever since. Some, such as Illuminor Xeras, seek to understand and seek ways to potentially reverse the process by exploring the biological. But this, in itself, also raises many deep, existential questions for figures such as Trazyn, but also just the Necron in a wider sense. At a surface level, they seem to have this desire to return to mortal forms, or some do anyway. Yet when truly pressed upon that question, presented with that reality of it actually occurring, the situation becomes more difficult. Would you trade immortality, basically invulnerability to the galaxy, for the pleasure once more of eating, to feel a breeze upon you, all the physical sensations that define a living being, yet know your life will be all but insignificant in its immense limitations in terms of longevity? Were that transference to take place, the Necron will be unrecognizable, for they are now defined by their immortal nature, their millions of years, the depths of their tomb worlds. They exist though as fragments of personalities, the dynasties are shattered remnants, their ancient rivalries still threaten any true sense of a unified empire, lest the Silent King find some way to bring all together once more. But as I was working through this, discussion of Trazyn hit once more on something that I have long contemplated because it is so interesting, and it is this concept of cultural memory being preserved across vast spans of time, to the point they become difficult even to comprehend. In human terms, Many of our most ancient structures exist having been built 1 to 5,000 years ago, which is already a difficult thing for us to comprehend in terms of imagining that time. There are still some remnants of human structures, traces that are found to be far, far older. But when you begin to think of the immense subject of how do you convey true information across these extended time periods, how to ensure your civilization can be understood or survive, it becomes incredibly complex and interesting. You will remember that I talked about this before with STC and related to our issue right now of how do you store information long term, even for 50 or 100 years, once you go beyond that. And you get into things like Microsoft's Project Silica, where they're basically trying to laser engrave on materials so that they will stand the test of time, so that our knowledge can be preserved for 1,000 years, 2,000 years. And that comes back to like this whole issue for humanity and STCs of how do you preserve information now over that period of time? Because essentially knowledge becomes the most powerful commodity for an entire civilization. So the Imperium, having survived for 10,000 years, as I've said before, is no small thing. In some respects, its backwards way of organising and heavily bureaucratically dictating the order of things, suppressing human development, may be some kind of bizarre answer to that, coupled of course with the likes of the Astartes being the ultimate arbiters of order, ensuring that things don't get out of hand and we don't just burn everything down. Nonetheless, Trazyn's project to preserve culture beyond all living memory is unique, because while many Necron rulers spend their existence attempting to reclaim lost power, others dream of restoring their species still. Some might seek dominion over the galaxy, even as the lost descend into madness, their damaged memories, corrupted systems, eroding what little remains of their former identities. And the less said of the Flare virus, that's feared by all Necron. So Trazyn's response to loss is different. He has come to this clear conclusion about how things should be handled. He certainly can come across as a greatly arrogant individual, but that's only because of his inherent nature. For Trazyn, he's effectively appointed himself as the guardian of galactic history. He decides what deserves preservation. He determines what events matter. He places himself in the role of historian, curator, and archivist for all of time. Again, you could view this as, like I say, being extraordinarily arrogant. But on the other hand, who else is going to do this, if not Trazyn? Other factions in M41 stand to just struggle constantly against the sheer scale of the galaxy, the unrelenting destruction which defines it. So historical preservation, whilst important, may not be top of their list of priorities. Look at, again, the Imperium, look at the Votan with their archives and their ancestor cores, etc. Not to mention the fact that Trazyn possesses traits that only someone who's existed for as long as he has would be capable of. His lifespan enables him to hold this true sense of objective perspective across the millennia. Trazyn will remember events which predate humanity, repeating patterns of life and culture across millions of years, so that even as the other races are struggling to preserve just a few generations of their history and then just clumsily lose it, have it stolen or just destroyed by themselves, Trazyn will preserve what he sees in that moment as worthwhile for future context, and the understanding of the memory that comes with that. And this is a distinction which helps to explain why he remains this memorable figure. I think it's quite simply that in a galaxy of war and annihilation over often the slightest pretext, Trazyn offers this different perspective. And it's more constructive, it's more amicable. It allows us as an audience to remember the full span arc of each faction's history. Because every relic that Trazyn acquires carries a story, a moment that might otherwise have been just lost forever. Every gallery in Solemnace serves as a reminder on a galactic scale. Trazyn knows inherently that a civilization and its culture will not immediately die alongside its populace, but it will when finally no one lives to still remember them. When examining Trazyn's origins, or for that matter so many characters in Warhammer, one continual barrier is that relatively little is known about his earlier life. And of what we know of Trazyn before biotransference, long before he became this eccentric archivist overlord of Solemnace, he was a figure already obsessive about the preservation of knowledge. So his entire purpose to exist as a Necron did not emerge as some quirk or realization after rising from the tombs. It began long before, and once we start to think about and understand the civilization that produced him, this makes a lot of sense. Now, the Necron origins are well known. I already kind of summarised this, but essentially for those unaware, or just to reiterate, the Necron tier were among the most ancient of starfaring species in galactic history. Tens of millions of years before the rise of humanity, they'd already built a vast interstellar empire which encompassed the majority of the galaxy, and this is why so many Imperial worlds now find themselves having to contend, unfortunately, with emerging Necron dynasties. Just a slight tangent here as well, a question that I've often seen discussed, or people saying, how did this occur, is where did the Necron find the time to basically build this galactic spanning empire? Because you will remember that they sort of had the war in heaven first with the old ones, that didn't work out too well, then the Catan came along and they had another war, and then they went into their great sleep, etc., having vanquished the Catan. So how did they have time for all of this? Well, the thing is, you've got to remember that humanity, in basically 30,000 years, has gone from being Stone Age to conquering the galaxy, rising and falling out of the Dark Age of technology, the Emperor, and so on. So quite a short period of time to achieve a lot. The Necron, similarly to the Eldar, had millions of years. The Second War in Heaven, which saw a totally different situation with the Old Ones and the Necron once more, was over this incredibly extended time. This is actually referenced in the Infinite and the Divine as well. It talks about that time span being about 5 million years. So they had a very, very long time to expand and build their empire. And this is because their technological achievements were so substantial. It allowed them to colonize worlds across enormous distances, establish the dynasties which controlled regions of space on a scale only zenith achievements of humanity could relate to. And for all of these accomplishments, despite this advanced technology, the Necron tier had been cursed with this problem that they were unable to solve: the accelerated genetic degradation, or to say it more plainly, their lives were just very short. Their planet of origin had been barren, radiation blasted, making it incredibly hostile to life. This is, of course, before they expanded into the galaxy. And that made them a species that were afflicted by illness, physical frailty, these brief lifespans. And understandably, that's why they attempted to flee and then expand their civilization. But in their horror as they did so, they carried this suffering with them into the stars. Their colonies flourished, their dynasties expanded, but their cancers and their genetic destabilization haunted them still. It continued to claim their lives long before their time. The specifics of that are never fully explained, but you would imagine if their home star caused that poor health, leaving this area would resolve that, and that's what the Necron tier thought as well. But unfortunately that was not the case. So whether their condition was entirely the result of their home star's irradiation of the planet, or a more fundamental weakness in their biology, remains uncertain. Some consider that the star impacted their species for so long that it damaged their genetics so deeply they were never able to fully recover this. Regardless though, the consequences were clear. Death occupied their every thought. It became a central focus within Necron tier society. Not necessarily in a morbid way, but their culture became occupied with ancestry, lineage, remembrance, and hereditary legacy. Monumental tombs were constructed for rulers and nobles. Dynastic histories were preserved with extraordinary care. The accomplishments of individuals mattered so much because those individuals would not remain alive for very long, and this is why they have those vast tomb worlds. I think often people get confused and imagine that the Necron built tomb worlds because they were going into this great sleep. And certainly there are aspects of that which are true. Some of the technology that they put in place, they knew they were going to needs to last for a significant amount of time, but largely their habit of creating these vast tomb complexes was because of their dynasties, their societal structure, and this focus and obsession about death, which I find to be greatly intriguing as a concept because it underscores for a galactic civilization, again, this importance about memory, the preservation of knowledge being able to be passed through generations to ensure advancement as a people. And this became woven into the very structure of the Necron civilization. And the context is particularly relevant when we're examining Trazyn, because that all helped to explain why an archivist could achieve such prominence within Necron tier society. His role is very important as a preserver of records, historical knowledge. And so while other members of the ruling dynasties were focused on political power, military campaigns, or advancement within the rigid hierarchy of their civilization, Trazyn devoted himself to the collection and maintenance of information, of knowledge. In the big picture, that could still seem unremarkable, perhaps initially, but I think it reveals something essential about his character, because just like the Mechanicus, ultimately it is those who retain and focus on the preservation of knowledge who ultimately become powerful, given the attrition of time, and that's still true in M41 for the Imperium and others. Because even before the immortality provided by biotransference became possible for the Necron, Trazyn was already looking at knowledge, both cultural and technical, on a different scale to many others. Thus, the collector, who would later go on to fill entire galleries with historical artefacts and examples of galactic history, had already begun to emerge. So even as the wider Necron civilization was entering a period of growing structural instability, despite their technological sophistication, they found themselves overshadowed by the Old Ones in that era. And for the rare few who are unaware, the Old Ones were believed to be this first sentient advanced race in the galaxy, an ancient species whose mastery of both science and warp allowed them to accomplish projects which still define the galaxy in M41. They also actually created the Great Rift, if you are unaware. That's actually referenced in a short story related to the Infinite and the Divine, the Bleeding Stars, where basically Trazyn is remembering that the Old Ones created the instability, they tore the galaxy around the Eye of Terror, but then of course that spread. He talks about the Necron having to basically repair that rift. And I don't think that's referenced anywhere else actually. It's essentially revealing to us that the Old Ones during the War in Heaven millions and millions of years ago damaged the galaxy and created that rift tear between real space and the warp. So that's an interesting little small lore bit there. And again, what triggered those wars was the disparity between the two races of the Old Ones and the Necron tier. Because little can be said with certainty about anything 65 billion years in the past, but the Old Ones are essentially believed to have been immortal, and for the Necron tier with their lives of pain, the spectre of death haunting their lives, to unlock the secrets of that would have allowed them to escape that cycle. The Old Ones just said no, they refused to share, and in fairness they may have held legitimate reasons given what followed, but nonetheless, the Necron tier did not take the withholding of information to the only goal they really cared about particularly well, and a conflict unseen in scale would follow. Now when we're talking about that conflict, I will note again, the War in Heaven, it's often referred to singularly as that title, but there were multiple wars in heaven. There was the first one and the later one, which was much more significant, but they're never referred to with any numerical chronology. In the first instance, when they were still mortal, the Necron tier lacked really the means to defeat the Old Ones. Despite both possessing advanced technology and large military resources, their repeated failures just deepened their existing frustrations among the Necron tier rulers, and so they continued to suffer under this burden of mortality, while simultaneously having to accept that they had been crushed. The Old Ones then moved on to just do other things, but the Necron tier did not. Their bitter resentment consumed them entirely, and over time that resentment transformed into desperation. Thus enter the bizarre forms known as the Catan. These immense entities, I don't think it's a stretch to refer to them as being godlike, for their power seems almost limitless. They're functionally immortal and able to consume the stars themselves as a source of power. Nobody really understands what the Catan are, but they're able to just consume the souls of mortal sentient beings as well. Having somehow made contact with them, the Necron tier were offered something that they had sought for generations, freedom from death. And it was a near, of course, irresistible appeal. to cast off the shackles that had restrained them for so long, their fragile biological bodies. This would enable them to finally solve the central problem which had defined their entire species since its birth, and there are figures like Illuminor Xeras, who basically championed going into the biotransference furnaces, which is why it's so interesting that now he's seeking for ways for that to be undone. Of course, also the Silent King championed this occurring, and then was not happy about that later. Because a wise man might have thought to ask, when doing this whole process, what's the catch? The Necrontyr were not ready for the answer. Instead, they willingly, for the most part, entered the furnaces that would be the mechanism of their own annihilation. In this era, Trazyn, a being of flesh, had personally witnessed the decline of the civilization and ultimately the decisions that would infamously destroy it. One particularly significant aspect, though, was his relationship with Orican, the Diviner. Now, just briefly, Orican was set to become a warrior class of the Necrontyr, but his feeble nature left him looking into mystic astromancy, a more academic role. But early on, he fell into a rivalry with Trazyn, and thus their relationship predates biotransference itself. For where Trazyn was focused upon the preservation of history, Orican devotes himself to the study of celestial patterns and the prediction of future events. Their disagreements would then continue for millions of years. The transformation which followed is among the most consequential events in the entire history of the 40k setting, because under the guidance of the Silent King and the Catan, the Necrontyr underwent biotransference. Their souls were consumed, their consciousness was transferred into bodies of living metal, their organic forms permanently destroyed. Of course, the significant catch was that what the Necrontyr believed they would receive and what they actually did proved to be very different. Yes, immortality was technically achieved, but it came at an immense cost. Mostly for the lower classes of Necrontyr citizen, for as the Catan consumed their souls, the vast majority of the Necrontyr lost what made them individuals or even sentient. The collective populace of the Necrontyr race were reduced to mindless drones. The civilization which emerged retained its military strength in a manner of speaking, but sacrificed something inestimably more valuable, their culture and their individuality. Even for those more senior Necrons who survived, such as the Cryptex, the Lords, the Pharaons, their memories over time became fragmented or incomplete, their personalities were diminished. And when the passage of millions of years was compounded upon this, it inevitably worsened their problems. They now suffered damage, corruption, repeated awakenings that eroded what remained of their original selves. Some dynasties just descended into madness, others awoke to find their records being damaged beyond repair, and vast portions of Necron history vanished despite their immortality. It is important to reiterate this early history because it underscores why now, in M41, the Necron awakening is being handled so slowly. Immense care has to be given over to the awakening of any important Necron figure, and to a lesser extent, the armies that rise from the tombs, because revival occurring too quickly appears to increase the risk of loss and damage to the individual. What makes Trazyn particularly unusual is that while he was certainly altered by biotransference, the core aspects of his personality appear to have survived far more successfully than many of his contemporaries. So now, rather than pursuing this conquest or dynastic supremacy, he simply expanded those same interests that already defined him before the fall. But the importance of his great work burns within him, a passion far stronger than it ever did in his mortal years, despite having now escaped the threat of death upon he and the Necrontyr. While his people accepted biotransference out of a fear of death and oblivion, and in the process destroyed themselves, Trazyn himself remains one of the most clear remnants of the Necrontyr. He has that same determination to preserve the past and extend memory, yet now for an entirely different purpose. When the Necrontyr were destroyed, significant elements of their civilization and culture died with them. Trazyn would, of course, see the immense tragedy here, and thus now seeks to preserve, wherever possible, other histories as well as their own, for he sees this as the most important task. Consequently, his methods are questionable, but his collection is not just important to him as just this emotional pursuit, it's more about what it represents. which I think is well illustrated to us when Orican threatens Trazyn not with physical violence, but with the destruction of valuable artefacts. Trazyn is consumed by a choking rage, not just at the desecration, it's about the loss of these objects from his gallery. It's the cultural loss that can never be recovered. For he has many artefacts from the time when the Necrontyr was still mortal. He has beautiful works of art, ceramics, and to see these priceless artefacts from that time destroyed is beyond his ability to cope, because the true price of their immortality was, yes, their souls, but we need to take that in a very real sense, because now, no longer can the Necron create art, culture, beauty. They're bereft of such abilities to create and use their imagination. Thus, Trazyn seeks to preserve what he can. His desire to preserve artistry in his galleries is so strong, paired with the ability to exist as a being on a timescale of millions of years, has left him to realize that perhaps, given the opportunity, he would not, in fact, choose to have mortal life. He would choose something else. He willingly has become the great archivist, the last historian chasing the greatest archival gallery in the entire galaxy, the preservation of all things, so that he may stand at the end of time and know that his work is done. And I think we have to wonder if there isn't a large element within this about trying to redress the errors of the past, just like the Silent King feels an all-consuming guilt about what occurred with biotransference. Similarly, Xeras. I think Trazyn feels a need to try and redress the balance of what was lost, and he's trying to make attempts to restore the immense and catastrophic loss that was suffered when their civilization essentially imploded. Now, with the background of Trazyn's origin established, it helps us to explain why he ended up as this bizarre galactic collector. But it would be his world of Solemnace which defined the scale of his obsession. History throughout the galaxy tends to, as I said before, survive in fragments. An imperial governor might preserve the select records of a few centuries. An inquisitor might gain access to lost archives on an annihilated planet stretching back several millennia. Among the Xenos races, but especially the Eldari, so much is lost through the catastrophic warfare and just the passage of immense time span. More broadly, just in the violence and horror throughout the galaxy, unknown numbers of cultures have just disappeared entirely. Look at the Great Crusade. So something Trazyn has noted when digging down into the lower levels of planets is his discovery of cultures who rose and fell in millions of years when nobody was aware of their existence at all. Their civilizations emerged, prospered, and collapsed into total apocalypse, with nobody ever having witnessed it. Solemnace, then, exists as Trazyn's answer to this galaxy defined by destruction, for it's far more than just a conventional tomb world. The planet itself is an immense artificial construct, and this might be described as a planetary-sized Dyson sphere. Its outer layers are formed by a surface that is constantly maintained by nanomachines, reshaped as necessary at a microscopic level. Then orbiting structures high above the world capture its excess energy, redirecting it back towards the planet. At its core, though, is a power source that you can probably guess at, for the Necron would repurpose their ancient betrayers in shards that form the foundation of their vast energy and power. Beneath its engineered shell lies an enormous network of so-called prismatic galleries. This is Trazyn's museum, where collections are preserved in perfect stasis. The chambers contain artifacts, historical recreations, living exhibits that replay their lives endlessly, gathered across thousands or millions of years. The world is also home to one of the largest repositories of knowledge in existence, with its archives so extensive they could be compared easily to the legendary Black Library of the Eldari. So the scale of Solemnace is difficult to comprehend. Its corridors, its galleries, vaults, and hidden passages have expanded continuously for millennia. They're shaped and reshaped by endless canoptic construction scarabs and overseeing cryptech. The process has been ongoing for so long that even Trazyn himself no longer knows the full extent of his domain. Vast regions remain empty, waiting for future acquisitions and exhibitions. The depths to what is contained within his galleries has almost no limit. Artifacts, weapons, relics, devices, and as I say, entire scenarios that illustrate key moments in galactic history. Imagine the heresy standing on display, key battles where he will take figures and then place them either in static positions like a diorama or in active replaying of that moment where they will just go through their lives endlessly over and over again. Some of what's contained there is also so old that no living civilization remembers it. Others are deeply personal to the Necron, with examples only existing here in his gallery. Trazyn has spent a lifetime locating and preserving the relics of his own civilization. But objects are not enough to satisfy Trazyn. I think, like myself, he holds a deep fascination with the context of things. And that's because context defines the story of all things. Without it, you really have no other parameters than something being a physical curiosity. And to make a small personal tangent, this is why I cannot abide people just walking through museums, snapping pictures on their phones. I've literally seen people go through just going click, 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 and they never really stop to look at what they're looking at and read about what they're looking at. It's unbearably disrespectful and intolerable. Anyway, the point is, though, a relic becomes inestimably more valuable with its story when it's connected to the event which made it important. And this stands true as well from Trazyn's perspective. A historical figure will become more significant when preserved alongside the circumstances which defined their life and that moment. So his ultimate goal is for the Necron dynastic visitors coming to Solemnace will not merely observe relics of history, static objects. They will experience history, they will walk through history, entering into his dioramas of living beings in stasis, that they may walk around a subject three-dimensionally, touch it, get some sense of what took place here, or watch actual battles taking place. And Trazyn does nothing at a small scale. He holds entire scenarios preserved within the galleries, military formations frozen at the instant of engagement, warriors locked in their final moments before death, victory or defeat, creatures from distant worlds displayed within carefully constructed environments designed to replicate their behaviour and original habitats. Some exhibits capture events of enormous historical significance, others preserve obscure, tangential moments that would otherwise have disappeared from the historical record entirely, maybe just private moments between individuals but which had wider significance. This of course means that many of Solemnace's exhibits never intended for themselves to have been collected, but thankfully most are entirely unaware that they have been. For Trazyn, whatever he deems to be a significant event means that then, by its very nature, is enough to justify his intervention. And it's this which creates one of the central tensions surrounding his work upon Solemnace. There's no question that Trazyn preserves things that might otherwise be lost forever, and there is value in that. The problem is that the vast majority within his galleries are most certainly stolen. From Trazyn's point of view, the justification is straightforward and obvious. History just cannot be recovered once it's already destroyed, so he sees no argument that could really be made to challenge this. He's preserving things, not least when throughout the galaxy there stands to be countless examples that support that perspective. Imperial archives burned in exterminatus, forge worlds consumed by ravenous hordes, extinction occurring continuously, and with that its cultural wealth. Every century that passes bears witness to the destruction of knowledge accumulated through generations. Trazyn then sees himself as operating against that tide. He's attempting to hold this back, and whether his own personal justifications are sufficient is entirely a matter of perspective. But a key detail which could contribute potentially to the positive view of Trazyn's gallery upon Solemnace is the sheer variety of material contained within. Trazyn doesn't focus exclusively upon Necron history. He holds immense stores of human civilization, Eldar, Orc warbands, extinct Xenos species, random archaeological discoveries, military campaigns, biological specimens, and so on, because he values the significance of their place in a relative moment in time. And that's an important distinction because it's one of those details which is surprising in a galaxy defined by xenophobic extermination at basically every opportunity. The Necron, once seen as these nightmarish undead beings who exterminate life on sight, have in the contemporary Imperium shown themselves to be not necessarily more neutral, but certainly more nuanced, and undoubtedly they still scour humanity wherever they can, but there are these moments and figures where they show a different side to themselves. Trazyn's vast museon reflects his perspective that the significance of an event is not determined by necessarily who won, but by whether it deserves to be remembered. Thus, Trazyn holds not only one of the most objective records of galactic events, but also perhaps the most comprehensive historical archive in existence, because he would just think to record things that, say, a victor of a conflict may not. And there are small references throughout various sources which point to him having preserved events or cultures that no longer survive anywhere else. Entire species may be remembered forever and singularly because Trazyn chose to collect evidence of their existence before they disappeared, and had he not done so, there would be nothing to show for them, no memory that they existed at all. Whereas, think about the Imperium. They would just burn away any remnant before rising their immense hive cities and fabrication centres atop. So Solemnace holds this unexpectedly melancholic quality, because it stands really as a tomb that contains the last surviving evidence of civilizations that would have otherwise been just erased. And this again comes back to the strange duality of Trazyn's character itself. On the one hand, you could easily view Solemnace as being comedic. The eccentric immortal Necron obsessively acquiring artefacts obviously opens itself up to parody, especially involving this rivalry with Orican. It's basically two old men fighting in public. But as is typical with 40k, there exists a deeper, more tonally serious framing as well. And the more you consider how Trazyn got to where he is, the more apparent its underlying tragedy becomes. Because his exhibits speak to vulnerability, the nature of conflict, the loss that occurs beyond all estimation, and most of all moments which seemed so significant maybe in the moment to those whose entire lives had built to that singular point. Now, that's lost entirely to time. Without Trazyn to preserve that moment, no one would ever remember they happened at all. As a Necron, Trazyn might understand better than most that survival doesn't guarantee a chronicle of any notable integrity. I think that's true within all civilizations, that there's this inevitability that those who continue to exist do so while selectively forgetting what once was and the sacrifices made by generations past. And that's because archives are neglected, corrupted, the truth of things can be so easily distorted by the victors or any number of environmental, cultural factors. And this is of course an interesting topic within history or science fiction in general. In human society, we already struggle to recall with significant accuracy and free from bias the events of even a century or two previous. For the vast majority, within 2 generations it becomes difficult for most to recall that we did anything at all, which is an immense tragedy, but it does speak to the importance of preservation of personal information to study and learn the history of our own lives and, if possible, pass that forward. It's easily said, but also extraordinarily difficult to practice. I'll give you a personal example. I struggle to recall in detail the memories of one of my grandfathers, because he passed away when I was only 7 or 6 years old. I know the things he did in his life. I know that he was on board aircraft in World War II. I feel very proud about his life and the things that he did and what he meant to my family. But all I can remember is more of an emotional feeling than any detail. And I find myself lately thinking about how I can pass that on to my daughter 2 generations apart. The task seems near impossible because she'll never be able to resonate those same emotional feelings I have. And the point is that this illustrates how quickly the specifics and the connections to our memory and history are just lost. I can tell her about these things, but she will never be able to use that information connected in an emotional way like I do. Another example would be something like the television documentary The World at War. it's a well-renowned series, it manages to create connection to the viewer by using individuals still alive at the time who spoke directly about their experiences. Also a fantastic narration by Laurence Olivier. However, it also has issues from a contemporary perspective because it minimized some events intentionally or otherwise, it used inaccurate footage sometimes because no other existed, and elsewhere they couldn't give a complete perspective of what took place at the time of its making because some records and accounts remain classified. So it's a fantastic series, it's something that everybody should watch, but as an analogy, I think it's a good example of how in trying to document and archive history, whilst also making it accessible and connect in a memorable way, it's extremely difficult to do that with a pure sense of accuracy, and perhaps that never really can be achieved without having some bias, errors, or accepting necessary compromise. To return to Trazyn, I think that Solemnace can therefore be viewed as his answer to the problem he had observed repeated across millions of years. That culture and individual memory is so fragile, it reveals this inherent vulnerability in archiving all history. And so, instead of merely recording it, Trazyn sought to protect the ability to connect with this through his process of collection. That those in thousands or millions of years will be able to enter, observe, and experience those moments in history with certainty and accuracy. Nowhere else in the galaxy has a single individual devoted so much effort to preserving the past. And I think this is in part because he exists outside of the civilizations that he raids. He's disconnected from those institutions across countless worlds that have failed to safeguard their own knowledge. Trazyn, through his admittedly comical levels of persistence, has assembled a collection that spans epochs of galactic history, that are only possible due to the extraordinarily advanced nature of Necron technology. And because Solemnace exists as more than just a museum, it stands in my mind of everything that Trazyn is as an individual, a reflection of who he once was, and now an extension of his true capability via his acquired immortality. He took the lessons learned from the mistakes of his own civilization, and through watching innumerable mortal empires rise, fall, and disappear, Trazyn built his great gallery to ensure that even as all inevitably cease to exist, there will be a record of their existence, that his empire of the Necron will stand to bear witness to what was. Now, in saying all this, it does paint something of a rose-tinted view of Trazyn, and undoubtedly he is a beloved figure within 40k, yet it would be wrong to ignore the fact that despite all the admiration Trazyn receives, there's an uncomfortable reality beneath almost every story focused upon him, because nearly all of Trazyn's greatest achievements are built upon theft. The galleries of Solemnace are filled with treasures gathered over millions of years, but very few of those treasures were willingly given. Artefacts removed from ancient tombs, battlefields, libraries, shrines, and private collections. Entire military formations vanished from the middle of active campaigns. As we've talked about, historical figures, scholars, soldiers, explorers, all find themselves incorporated into his exhibits that they never agreed to join. So Trazyn simply ignores factors of legitimate ownership or stewardship. His primary concern is only the significance of what he places within his gallery. Once he determines that something deserves preservation, questions regarding rightful possession just become secondary concerns, if at all. And the reasoning behind this approach is obviously not difficult to understand, as we've already talked to him, having watched entire civilizations disappear through whatever means, war, neglect, fanaticism, whatever. On that basis, Trazyn, seeing entire cultures vanish without any ability to leave meaningful records, leaves him to apply his logic of securement for the gallery with extraordinary confidence. He may not engage with the subject matter at all, and instead assume responsibility for preserving it himself. The collection on Solemnace contains numerous examples of that mentality, but others are more hard to justify. You might have individuals removed from their own lives because Trazyn considered them historically important. And we see this in the Rogue Trader DLC, in fact, entire moments effectively frozen in an unending loop for all eternity because Trazyn decided they deserved preservation. But what about those individuals, those figures, those armies in a wider context? What might they have done later? Trazyn, of what we know, doesn't appear to be needlessly cruel unless he's just tormenting other Necron who have crossed him. So his exhibits are not retained in any way because he enjoys their suffering. His entire purpose is driven by genuine intellectual fascination. But this distorts his perspective also relative to others, because while Trazyn values history so highly, he struggles to understand why others would place competing concerns above its preservation. From the perspective of others, Trazyn's endless pottering and documenting seems irrelevant while the rest of the galaxy is destroying itself or trying to forge some kind of path forward. And to give some sense of the significance of the things that Trazyn collects, within his prismatic galleries, they contain the likes of the catacombs of Calth during the Underground War, the death of Lord Solemnace, Imperial heroes of tyrannic wars, the beheading of Goj Vandire. He's even said to hold the head of Sebastian Thor, one of the most important figures in all of Imperial history, even a Thunder Warrior from the Unification, and perhaps most horrifying of all, an ossified husk of an enslaver. And if you don't know what an enslaver is, go look up The Age of Strife. But I think the wider point is that Trazyn is a very unconventional character in this sense, because he appears as more of a supporting role than a lead character. He's no Guilliman or Ghazghkull. He helps us, though, to define the galaxy which exists in M41, and whilst he may be saving irreplaceable pieces of history, he's also violating the boundaries of other factions and civilizations. And you can raise some important questions there about potential damage that he's inflicting unintentionally or indirectly upon cultures through this preservation of their civilization legacy. But he's also fundamentally denying its descendants access to their own heritage, which is important. And also, like I say, who knows what somebody may do after a significant battle. Just taking them out of history, that's quite problematic. But I think it's this strange ambiguity that makes Trazyn so compelling. His demeanour always seems to be something like, humble metal lord tries his best. That's how it feels. But we can recognise that most characters in 40k are defined by a lot simpler motivations than that. And so, he may at times be misguided, but Trazyn is at least consistent through his instinctive need of preservation, which is very admirable, but of course the only problem that comes along with that is, at what cost? So Trazyn's reputation as this bumbling stamp collector, effectively, who's just lovable in his eccentricity, is something that I think obscures how dangerous he actually is. And this is only further obscured by the humour in his own behaviour and personality, especially the stories where it can feel, like I say with Orokin, you've got two old Necron men arguing over property boundaries or something like this. So that leads to people having this impression that Trazyn is little more than this eccentric collector that just stumbles into major events and it's all very funny, but it doesn't matter. The reality through the lens of the lore is quite different. Trazyn is far from being a comical character. In fact, he exists as one of the most resourceful and enduring individuals. He utilises a variety of means to ensure that he survives every encounter. His calm, often passive presence is only because he's got no fear whatsoever of death. Like many Necron nobles, Trazyn possesses, of course, the technology to avoid permanent death. And that's not a shock revelation for anybody who understands Necron capabilities. But Trazyn takes this a level further, projecting himself into disposable forms to ensure his consciousness can just be transferred to a secure location. Because if there's one thing he understands, it's how to persist across thousands and millions of years. Even the efforts of those who would seek to eliminate him frequently amount to little more than a temporary setback. And it's because he maintains many surrogate bodies capable of serving as replacements. He can also effectively overwrite any other Necron to continue operating in them as a new form. But survivability aside, Trazyn, like I said much earlier, is no warrior. In the time before biotransference, he was little more than a scholar figure, so hardly someone trained in the ways of combat. Rare would it be for him to, say, venture onto a battlefield. So in terms of literal combat, he might not necessarily be the most dangerous combatant to face, but martial skill does not necessarily build the entire picture. Trazyn has other abilities that make him an extremely dangerous opponent, one of which is just his ability to understand others, to plan traps for them, to use his collection itself where necessary and justifiable in his eyes. Also, of course, to just capture people in a pocket dimension. As an overlord of the Nihilak dynasty, Trazyn has the capability to also just wield significant military forces should he choose to. And while the use of that can be a contentious issue among Necron nobility and their councils politically due to awakening subjects, he has and can historically call on these resources as necessary. And then beyond that, he has even more to deploy should the need arise, and this has been demonstrated because he has accumulated, of course, an archive not only filled with artifacts, but warriors, ferocious creatures, military formations. So for example, during the fall of Cadia, Trazyn used the capability of Solemnace to draw a fraction of acceptable stored forces as he deemed necessary. He tossed a Tesseract cube to release forces of Astartes captured during the Heresy, along with some Imperial Guard from throughout the galaxy that just strayed into his capture, and be it in that situation or any other, most emerging from this would have no sense that anything really had changed from the moment they were captured. As I say, most of his exhibits probably have no awareness that where they are at all. And so there may be some disorientation, but Astartes breaking out back into reality and then immediately citing heretic traitor space marines, they most likely will, and did, engage those straight away with no explanation necessary. So Trazyn can basically just throw out Imperial forces as he wants to. Now I will add that this does contribute significantly to the characterization of Trazyn, basically just throwing Pokeballs out into reality and then Space Marines just exploding onto the field and doing battle for him. And it is very funny because then he can just retreat to go and complete whatever task he arrived or secure some artifact. And you can't escape the comedy of Trazyn, so he does have that going on. And to be fair, it would be pretty terrifying if you just thought that you were having a normal battle and then suddenly bang, an ambull is coming at you or whatever. I think then you've also got the fact that Necron science, no matter what it is he's utilising, operates at a level that is just incomprehensible from an Imperial perspective. And for somebody such as Trazyn, who spent millions of years gaining additional knowledge and artefacts, he obviously has the power of his dynasty, and he's one of the oldest individuals in this setting, altogether makes him just in himself an extremely powerful weapon. And then also just to throw out there his typical use of mind shackle Necron scarabs. These embed themselves at the base of your skull and basically allow you to be controlled like a puppet. And Trazyn would again use those in combination with his exhibits to fight off whatever enemy he needed to. So ultimately, for as comical a figure as he can be, Trazyn shouldn't be mistaken being a harmless observer. He's vanquished countless foes with ease, and while he may prefer collecting history to forging it, he possesses quite readily the resources, knowledge and technology to just dictate events to his will, with a terrifying finality. So to make a mandatory summary conclusion, throughout the galaxy there are figures who seek practical, direct actions, often in defense of their civilization, to secure some necessary asset, or just galactic wars throughout M41. Even the most predatory Xenos tend to seek conquest of resources or pure territory. Few are those who seek some higher goal or lend themselves singularly, perhaps selflessly, to a personal crusade. Trazyn is very obviously one such individual if you leave out the selflessness part. And I think it's how he executes this that makes him such an appealing, interesting figure. He's one who I would imagine, like many of us, allows himself to become entirely consumed by the details of his great task, just how I could allow myself to become consumed by reading, writing and crafting. Those tasks which just entirely draw you in, you lose all concept of time, body and mind. Within the galleries of Solemnace exist Trazyn's obsession, his endless acquisitions, frozen, bitter rivalries, artifacts of inestimable value, priceless beyond any comprehension, dark figures who plotted schemes to bring down a city, world, empire. You could see it all through a very serious lens, and Trazyn can be presented as such, and has done so repeatedly. Yet Warhammer 40,000, like it or not, is also defined by its moments of dark humour, brutality, satirical or otherwise. All contribute to those characters who stand above and apart from everyone else. For me, when it comes to Trazyn, the most compelling question has in fact very little to do with collecting. It's what sits beneath the surface of his character that I remain occupied with in my mind. And indeed, it is a question that science fiction has pondered for decades. That being, what becomes of a civilization once it has achieved everything it set out to? When resources are essentially limitless, when power is no longer a restriction, disease and conflict have all but no meaning. Then what? This remains a question in the long term for the Necron. It's why some of their number, like Xeros, have already begun to imagine a future that exists outside of their immortal living metal bodies that they have existed confined to for millions of years. The early stages of any civilization are very relatable, easy to understand. A species may struggle for its base survival, it's going to seek knowledge, it wants to dominate its own world, to expand its territory. It's going to develop ever more sophisticated technology over generations, gradually increasing its control over the environment itself. Progress has a clear direction because there are obvious obstacles to overcome. Resources are limited though, knowledge appears to be incomplete, people's lifespans are finite. So the curve initially is slow, every generation inherits problems that have to be solved, and so on. But eventually, the curve is going to start to rise more exponentially. Technology solves problems. Those solved problems enable technology that solves further problems, that ensures stability, power, culture. Soon, energy becomes barely a thought. Resources are finally accessible off-world, and expansion begins. Traditional goals become less important, any kind of scarcity can be actively reduced or eliminated, disease entirely conquered, lifespans could be extended beyond that of their ancestors, communication and accessing knowledge becomes effortless across vast distances. So eventually, at least in theory and more of a science fiction perspective, a sufficiently advanced civilization will have overcome the bulk of its problems that any kind of mortal civilization would face. But then, it may even overcome mortality itself. And again, if you look at the Imperium and Space Marines, they kind of have done that. And this is what the Necron also believed that they were perhaps entitled to. They did find a means to that end, just not the one that they had imagined. Nonetheless, having achieved functional immortality, the question then becomes less whether a civilization can survive, and more, why does it now survive? Asimov's Galactic Empires, Ian M. Banks' Culture, Arthur C. Clarke's Post-Human Societies, and so on. Countless others, all exploring different versions of the same problem. It's an existential question which is just generally interesting. The practical challenges that all mortal civilizations occupy themselves with do not necessarily provide meaning for life. They appear to, but once you take those things away, what do you have left? A civilization could gain total mastery over its environment, yet still then struggle to determine what should be done now. This is where the culture aspect arrives: artistry, religion, societal value, and structure. All are things that people may occupy themselves with as a civilization once the practical challenges have been overcome. Now, the Necron occupy this particularly interesting position as one of the single factions in Warhammer 40,000 who remain so technologically advanced that their command of physical reality borders on the absurd. You've got the likes of the Celestial Orrery. They have the means by which to manipulate stars, reshape planets, traverse dimensions, employ technologies that appear classically akin to magic. Their empire achieved feats that place them far beyond the capabilities of most, and this is something that the Imperium and Guilliman are discovering in real time and with significant consequences in M41. Yet in this time of the Imperium Indomitus, the Necron are not a civilization which is enjoying the rewards of their own success. They may be powerful, but they're still defined by this bitterness of the situation they find themselves in. Their incapability haunts them, because being transformed beyond all recognition and having your empire fall to ruin, the vast bulk of your citizenry having their individual identities erased, the leadership continue to fight, to squabble over almost seemingly meaningless power and territory. Millions of years have passed since they entered the tombs for their great sleep. Now many Necron dynasties still remain consigned within the shadows of those irreversible decisions made during the War in Heaven. Trazyn's response to this is what separates him from others, because while they may dedicate themselves to the conquest, restoration or vengeance of their dynasties, he is unwaveringly engaged in his own project, which stretches far beyond the ambitions of a singular dynasty. I think Trazyn has rightly identified that it is the grand story of the galaxy itself which has become one of the few things which still, for them, carries meaning, and that the Necron could in some sense exist as custodians of. Solemnace is far more significant than a simple museum. I've described it as an archive, a collection, a repository of knowledge, and while all of those descriptions are accurate, it represents far more than this. Solemnace exists as an answer to the question of what remains when time itself effectively ceases to matter. Because for the Necron, time has all but no meaning. It doesn't define their lives now, it doesn't restrict them or constrain any of their goals. For most species, history exists only to make us aware of the struggles which came before, to define us even as each generation passes beyond living memory. And again, I'll note, if you've never read Infinite and the Divine or Twice Dead King, these readily illustrate the nature of the Necron themselves and how they exist in this bizarre reality where time spans just jump from one place to another. Now, of course, that's just the way it's written, but the key illustration is that these expanses of time have so little relevance to their decisions or lives as opposed to mortal beings for whom time is probably the most defining parameter. For the Necron, entire cultures rise and fall whilst they're just deciding what to do next. On the other end of the scale, within the various partitions of their mental constructs, they're able to have entire debates with themselves that would theoretically take weeks or months, but equate to actual fractions of a second. Trazyn, having personally witnessed such vast stretches of galactic history, is unique, because events that exist as myths to younger races, he may well remember directly. The vast passage of time that separates humanity from its earliest ancestors represents barely a measurable fraction of the time for which Trazyn has existed. And you can well imagine that that perspective would alter anyone's view, reshape your relationship between an individual and history. Because when the past no longer exists as this abstract concept, typically we see it reduced to records within books and archives, but when you're Trazyn, it's entirely more tangible because you are able to capture it, and its value therefore increases inestimably. It's something to preserve above all else. History is no longer words on a ledger, a record or an account thousands of years later. It's not fading into the pages. It's a very real moment of lived experience. And to allow this to vanish entirely without deliberate intervention in the eyes of someone like Trazyn would be as egregious as destroying it yourself. Ultimately, he understands that when all of the parameters by which we measure ourselves become irrelevant, preventable loss and an appreciation for the moments which the Necron can no longer experience themselves become paramount. Upon Solemnace, every exhibit exists because it was vulnerable. Each artifact only survived because of his intervention. The constructed scenarios and moments of history are preserved to reflect events which defined entire civilizations. And within a galaxy where ignorance dominates and historical knowledge is routinely destroyed, there's a strangely admirable quality to a character who has devoted himself to this simple act of preservation and remembrance. And directly relating to that is something which Trazyn comments on consistently, and that is the self-assured belief of other lower species, that all are so confident, all believe themselves to be wholly entitled to their mastery of the galaxy. They will expand exponentially, they will dominate all others. In their own eyes, they are the only ones who deserve to rule over all other things, even the natural laws themselves. Just look at the Imperium. But Trazyn understands they cannot see the full picture. He understands that no civilization lasts forever, not even perhaps their own. And he understands the greatest challenge of all is simply preservation, not destruction, not war. His great work within Solemnace cannot prevent that process, for no archive could be large enough to preserve everything. No historian can ever exist to save every story, work of art, every great moment of cultural zenith. And certainly no civilization can entirely resist the march of entropy, not even Trazyn. Yet I think there remains value in the attempt, and that's really the point of the matter. Because for all of his flaws, and there are many, said Orican, Trazyn continues onward in his great work. He seeks to preserve what he can, because only he can. Only he recognises that which seemingly so many of the galaxy's great powers have forgotten or who choose to actively ignore. That power, territory, and military victories are all but temporary achievements. All will inevitably become the past, and any stories which survive beyond will rarely endure a few generations. For the fragments that persist beyond millennia, they will often be the only evidence that a civilization upon a world ever existed at all. Having thought long about Trazyn to write this piece, I think this may in fact be the most important role Trazyn serves overall. Not a collector of artefacts or a curator of galleries. As I said much earlier, I think of Trazyn standing here as the final witness, and that's why I made the comparison earlier with Childhood's End. Because just like the overlords in that story, Trazyn exists to stand there and watch as planets are consumed by galactic fire, to remember events that nobody else ever will, to preserve cultures that no other will, to preserve the fragments of galactic history that would otherwise simply disappear without a trace. I sometimes think that Trazyn may be among the most important figures in the entirety of 40k, because his value lies directly in the effort itself, in the belief that some things remain worth remembering, even when the rest of the galaxy leaves their ashen remains to be washed away and fallen out of all memory. I thank you for watching today, and a short reminder that Trazyn's reach extends far beyond Solemnace and its prismatic galleries. His minor vaults are scattered throughout the galaxy, housing secrets of equal greatness. Among those vaults lies one dedicated to the Koronus Expanse, and here, throughout the ages, he's captured fragments of history and collected peerless artefacts from the Expanse, stored all within the halls of his museum. In the course of this pursuit many centuries ago, Trazyn crossed paths with the von Valentius dynasty. What happened was lost to the merciless tides of time until now. As a rogue trader, you will unravel the secrets of the dynasty's history, and in so doing, you may also find yourself attracting the attention of Trazyn the Infinite as you trespass upon his labyrinthine domain.